bio is in your program, and what I've asked him to do is speak for about 20 minutes, and then leave the rest open for questions, which I'm sure you'll have. So, Governor?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for that resounding applause. No. But no, I just wanted to say thank you for Stephen. It's just great. I'm always so thrilled when you come to New York and they have these incredible vistas. I'd like to remind everybody that you're looking at the sacred soil of New Jersey, what we affectionately refer to as the New Jerusalem. But I want to say thank you to Stephen. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be in this august hall and to be at John Jay, arguably the greatest thinker of criminal justice issues, and to Stephen and for the importance of the report. Today's topic and the focus of the conference is very intriguing in terms of, is America ready? But I'm going to just push us a little bit to think about what are we ready to advocate for. And I'll just start with, we have a Reentry Corporation. I'm just going to give you a little biographical sketch because most New Yorkers think like that Steinberg poster. They look at New Jersey as that thin slice. I grew up in Middlesex County, New Jersey. I was born in Jersey City. Governor Byrne used to say he wants to be buried in Jersey City so he can stay active in Democratic politics. And then I was a prosecutor in Middlesex County for some time, and then I was in the state legislature, governor, et cetera. Then sort of blew up my career, came out as gay, and that wasn't the hard part. Then after that, what do? You find God, and you go to seminary. And then you go to Harlem, and that was when was before it became bougie, when Harlem was Harlem. And I worked for a great program called Exodus, which was a recipient of one of the first 10 reentry pilot programs that was given by President Bush. Did that for a while, came back, worked at a women's facility in Hudson County for about 3.5, 4 years. Then Governor Christie was governor, and Chris said, well, why don't we do reentry on a larger scale basis? And so we were in Hudson County, then Newark, and then Passaic, and Ocean County, because that was the epicenter of the opioid crisis. And then we expanded it further and further, and then with Governor Murphy, even enlarging the footprint. Just let me tell you a little bit about what we do. We have 7,000 clients, and we're in central and northern New Jersey. We have 7,000 clients, and we provide a whole host of services, and whether it's medical services, HIV, diabetes, particularly medication-assisted treatment. Obviously, we're in the midst of the opioid crisis. Whether it's Vivitrol, whether it's Suboxone. We understand now that the purpose of reentry is not just to have somebody secure employment, the necessity to address their psychological, psychiatric, medical issues first, then their legal issues, then employment, housing and employment. Our employment rate stats are about 62%. We have more people on medication-assisted treatment than I think the Department of Corrections, but that's another story. And so we're doing a pretty good job. And I don't want to spend today talking about what successful reentry is, because I think everybody in this room hopefully knows what it is. What I'd like to challenge us all as thought leaders is to begin to think about, where do we go? What's our vision? What's our future? And so when I was a young assistant prosecutor, I remember prosecuting the smartest kids that lived in public housing because they were engaging in CDS distribution, saying to myself, this is just nuts, because all these young people are engaging in a market economy, and the only thing that they could sell was something called CDS, and we're putting them in jail, and then prison. And then I'm in the state legislature, and I still have this notion out of being in the prosecutor's office that there's this binary system. There's guilt and there's innocence. There's good and then there's bad. And thanks to the influence of my parents and so many individuals in my life, it begins to really gnaw at me. And I take my required visits to state prison for services, but I start really understanding that something's fundamentally wrong with this paradigm, with this template. But it's not until I go up to Exodus up in Harlem that I realize how badly this system is. And I'm sitting up there serving the worst pancakes in the world and the worst hot dogs in the world for breakfast and for lunch. And I'm dealing with guys that have done football time in New York State prisons and in federal prison, and just recognizing that they're struggling with all the things that people struggle with. Coming home, food, shelter, financial insecurity, relationships, and all the anxiety and all the fear, the palpable fear, the fear that's so evident. And so I come back, and after seminary, I come back and I say, all right, we're going to do this reentry program, and I'm going to think of all the things that we should be doing to provide services to people so that they don't live in this permanent stasis of fear. And I think we do actually a pretty good job. Our rearrest rate is 19.7. Our reincarceration rate is 8.8. We get accolades from all the right people, God willing. And by the way, if there's anybody from Vera here or any of the, hey, we got to shout out. You got to make sure you say hello to all the mockers. So over time, especially in the midst of the addiction crisis, I begin to more acutely understand the psychological pressures of so many of the individuals with whom we work. And in New Jersey, the close nexus between addiction and imprisonment, the conflation between addiction and imprisonment is perhaps among the highest in the state of New Jersey. That about 78% of our clients are addicted, and if you're addicted, there's also some point in your life, there's a high probability that there's an intersection with the criminal justice system. But I also begin to understand that, and I have a whole raft of information I'll save you from the Mishigash, the whole raft of information talking about the inability to make rational decisions or the reduced cognitive abilities of those who suffer trauma or trauma-informed decisions. And concurrent with that, the reduced resilience of individuals within the correctional system. And so that the challenge is, if people are profoundly making bad decisions because of how trauma has informed their childhood and their adolescence, which is only exacerbated by the virtue of prisons, and that their resilience in life is actually significantly diminished because of decreased familial relationships, because of the inability to have community connections, because of the over-reliance on a prison system that atrophies individual decision-making and thoughtful, virtuous decision-making, then the question becomes is, even if we do everything right in reentry, and we certainly don't, but we work aggressively to be in that place, what in God's name are we doing? So there are those of us, I think, and you look at efforts in Australia with community corrections, or even some of the fledgling efforts in this country looking at diversionary programs. But I think that we have to make the radical and significant decision that prisons as they exist, and we all know that the psychological harm that's done, but we need to understand that we as a country, as a community, have to begin the difficult process of fundamentally realtering this system in this nation. That prisons, for the vast majority of those in prison, are bad, are harmful, and are going to make those persons' behavior even more self-destructive and harmful to the community. So when I look to, and you can look at Department of Corrections outlays and expenditures and budgets in comparison with justice reinvestment and reentry programs, and it's seismic. Part of the challenge, I think, for the country is to make the argument to middle America, to people who look like me, to people that are from middle class, working families, why prisons don't work. And I think the argument is threefold. One, it's that the psychological imprint of prisons, by its design, does not encourage virtuous, responsible behavior. That the primary requirement of a warden is acquiescence. I remember I remember when I was up at Exodus Transitional Ministries, I would ask somebody that came out of Sing Sing to pick up the phone to get their GED, and there were guys that were bulked up. They couldn't literally pick up the phone to dial the number. And I remember saying to them, I would ask them repeatedly, time after time again, did you make that call to call for your GED? And they psychologically couldn't get to that place. And part of the reason was there was no reward for self-initiation. There was no reward for them taking it upon themselves to engaging in productive behavior. And so the first point that we have to understand, if we buy into whether it's a Jungian analysis, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy, at the end of the long day, prisons are a cancerous element to the notion of individuals making good, healthy decisions. And we need to, and that is so critically important. The second thing is the notion of surviving in prison doesn't necessarily augur well for your ability to thrive in community. I deal with guys all the time that jail well, that can survive in prison. You take them out for 2 weeks and they're a mess on the street because, they can't get a driver's license, they can't get a Medicaid card, they can't get housing, and all the things that they should get. But the problem becomes is they don't know how, they don't have the requisite support within the community. So if at the end of the long day, 97% of the individuals are coming home, then we need to understand how do we help individuals survive in community. And if you look at the models, and I just encourage you to look at the Australian model for community corrections, that the Australians have begun to understand that the fundamental underpinnings of the British colonial prison system that we still mysteriously enshrine is not what works. And so that they are moving radically towards a community-based correctional model that understands, but for a small percentage of those most violent prisoners, that we need to bring people into the community to provide them with the same services. Ironically, there are many of the same services that good reentry programs provide, but instead of making it just a matter of reentry, instead of just mitigating the damage of prison, let's provide them with community correctional alternatives from the outset, or for so much more early on in the process. New Jersey's taken a great first step with something called Earn Your Way Out, but it's still the notion of being in prison and then gradually earning your way out of prison. What we need to be arguing for is the Australian correctional model that understands that it needs to be community-based just the same way that reentry is. and to provide those services so much earlier. The third point that I'd just like to make is that we have to make a financial argument, and that's why, whether it's VERA or so many organizations, it's so important. That you look at the expense of, whether it's in New Jersey, $1.6 billion, you look at the expense of prisons, and everybody in this room knows the increase in the U.S. and state prison populations and how we've tried to mitigate it. But we have to make the financial argument that reinvestment is so much more prudent. But in addition to that, we also have to make the difficult argument of transitioning from a traditional template of prisons to a community-based model. And how do we do that? Well, part of that is that we need to engage both parties, both Republicans and Democrats, and understanding the importance of this community-based investment. And then we need to also underscore the fact that prisons per se, and I feel myself being guilty of this, it's not the argument that prisons are gradually bringing down the recidivism numbers, or that probation or parole. The point is that the system itself is fundamentally flawed, that the illness itself is wrong. And so I think that we need a different kind of argument. I think we need the argument to be said that at the end of the long day, it is not the recidivism of prisons that work, it's community-based corrections, and the numbers in Australia are tremendous, that provide the greatest measure of hope. And so, I think we've made great strides on reentry and people understanding, and the tragedy is when it was black and brown folk doing cocaine, nobody gave a damn, and it was a criminal justice problem, and then white folks started doing opioids, and shit, this is a healthcare crisis. And however we got there, and people are beginning to understand that reentry is critically important. But what I make up in my mind is, I can't change in 8 months what's happened to somebody over 8 years in a state prison. We can do everything right. We can provide for addiction treatment. We can treat their hepatitis. We can treat their HIV. We can provide them with decent housing. We can provide them with legal services to address the 27 insane warrants. We can register them into a skill-based program for a CDL license or HVAC or the building trades. And at the end of all of that, if their perspective, if their mindset, if their cognitive, if their thinking and their behavior is such that it's still trapped in that mentality of fear, of recrimination, of shame, at some point their level of resilience will weaken. And what I find so frustrating is that when it reaches that tipping point, it all cascades downward. And so my plea is, yeah, we have to convince America. But I also believe that we have to convince ourselves that the present system is not only radically flawed, that I would argue probably everybody in this room understands, but that we as a movement, as a university, as thought leaders, have to be moving inexorably towards community-based corrections for all but the few. That the challenge in America should not be how to survive a prison, but the challenge in America should be how to thrive in community. And that if 97% of the individuals in prison are coming home, instead of punishing them, instead of causing the psychological and behavioral harm that occurs in a wide documented body of literature, let's start so much earlier to helping them be the persons that they ought to be within the communities that they know and with the families they love. Thank you. So I by the way, I had this long ass speech, and I just like whatever.
We can reproduce it. That's fine. So we have 10 or 15 minutes or so.
Sure.
So let me start the questioning going with the variant of the title of our overall program, which is America Ready for Prison Reform? The real part of that question is, I think everybody agrees about the need for reform, certainly everybody here, but is American politics ready for prison reform?
Well, you know, it's one of the few areas that I think whether Republicans or Democrats actually agree on that our system is broken. And, you know, whoever, like, I'll make a deal with the devil to bring about criminal justice reform. But I think whether it's for the economic argument or for the compassion argument, people understand that our system doesn't work. That when you look at recidivism numbers, that it is broken. So I think there are multiple rhetorical arguments that we can make and that we should make them. But I think we're, unfortunately in this nation, cost has driven the country to reconsider mass incarceration more than morality. As abysmal and disappointing as that may be, I'll take it just to begin the process of reassessing.
But surely you'll agree that the picture doesn't look bright right now. If you have at the federal government level, Attorney General Barr pushing back at any idea that we can do progressive prosecutions or we can reduce sentencing. And although... But
it's interesting, though. Steve, Barr is doing what Barr does, but ironically, I can't believe I'm going to quote Trump, but the president actually understands that's not where the nation is. And so, you know, justice, I mean, you know, anyway, to go from Eric Holder to, but anyway, and even though I'm Irish, the expression oig volt says it best, but like Trump gets it. So I believe nationally, his political weather vane is such that people understand that we need to do this differently. So I think we have an opportunity. But what's important is that the people in this room are going to determine the scope of the argument. And so that's what concerns me. And like, even like when Stephen was kind enough to invite me here, I had an opportunity to really reflect and think and look what's happening around the world and Scandinavia. Look what's happening. And what we're doing is we're saying, well, let me just keep it in the eye, as they say in the rooms. I'm saying, yeah, less prison, more reentry. And what I, upon reflection, to say is, if the damn thing is broken, I shouldn't be saying less prison. I mean, there's that great article, there's a former law clerk of somebody from the Seventh Circuit, it was in Vox magazine, talked about the need to radically change prisons, that prisons ought to be a thing for the minority. And his point is, if we're 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's imprisoned population, well then, we ought to have only prisons for that 5% to be roughly analogous. And the way to do that is to, and he offers different models, but we need to start disestablishing prisons.
Okay, questions? Okay, Ted?
Thanks. Ted Guest from the Crime Report. Can I follow up on Steve's question? A lot of people like you have been making good talks about this for many years, and yes, a lot of politicians have talked about it, but isn't the real problem, it's not the federal government, but the states is where the action is. And my observation is over the last 10 years or so, a bunch of states have passed what I would call pretty minor reform laws, which have sort of tinkered around the edges. No state, to my knowledge, has done anything like you're suggesting. Can you analyze, you're a former legislator, why is that? This is never
Ted,
rises to the level?
And great question. By the way, just a shout out for New Jersey, collateral consequences Margaret Love gave New Jersey. Yes. Did you see that?
We ran it there.
New Jersey had the most progressive legislative session. You know, what do legislators do? You know, it's unfortunately so many of us have a law and order mentality, and it's, you know, the 60 seconds, the 60 minutes. And so there was a great professor at Yale University looked at the increase in laws from colonial times to the present day, and it's just fascinating. It's just like it's relatively constant. And then after World War II, you know, to play into to sort of respond to Michelle Alexander, it just skyrockets because of race, drugs, etc. So the point being is, yes, you've got to make those changes, but we're doing it in New Jersey, and you know, you've got in New York, you've got the Fortune Society with the great Joanne and David Rothenberg, you've got Osborne. So I think what we do a lot of with schools. I mean, you're blessed to have John Jay here, but we work closely with universities, we work closely with faith-based institutions, communities of color, to start putting pressure on the state legislature. I mean, it's sad, but the opioid addiction crisis, I'll speak for New Jersey, has been somewhat of a trigger in reassessing. I mean, you know, for all the problems that I just referred to earlier, but I think it can happen though, Ted. Back? You can just yell.
No, we need, because we're on.
Look, Steve's proper.
Hi, Chelsea Marcius, New York Daily News. How do you get people?
It's so good to like be actually like when she says the New York Daily News, I don't go, now I don't give a shit. So like
I get many reactions.
Exactly.
How do you convince people in rural communities who are employed by prisons, where, by the way, farming might have been a major source of income, industry might have been a major source of income, and now they look at prisons as jobs, and that's how they view it, as you're taking away their jobs. When industry's gone, farming is what it is, and there's very little else driving the economy there. And not that we should look at prisons as economic drivers at all, but a lot of people do.
Your first name is?
Chelsea.
Chelsea, that is the toughest question. It's an economics question. So Chelsea, I just want to unpack that. Why are those prisons there in the first place? Those prisons there are in the first place as an economic stimulus to the region. So that someone made the decision that because of farming, because of challenges with the manufacturing sector, we're going to place a prison in that community which will have support by the incumbent population, which are traditionally working class, white, and that will quote unquote benefit by virtue of the economic stimulation. And Chelsea, that question is perhaps the most difficult question. It's not whether or not prisons work, it's not whether or not prisons cause harm, it's not whether or not the psychological impact or the derivative impact of prisons upon persons traversing through prisons, but it's understanding the economic impact of closing prisons and what is that replaced with. So, you know, you look at different arguments that have been made that part of the real challenge in moving away from the mass industrialization of prisons in this country is to reinvest in justice, but it's also to reinvest in those communities. That has to be part of the process, because at the end of the day, I look at New Jersey, and in Cumberland County we have, which is poor rural, I wouldn't say poor, it's working class, largely white, that the prisons serve as an economic stimulus. If you were to eliminate those three prisons, it would have a precipitous impact on employment. And so that on a case-by-case basis, I think you have to evaluate what the alternative is, the same way that you would do for upstate New York or for central Pennsylvania. But I think, so that's a very prescient question, because I think increasingly the debate on prisons is not only among, like, no disrespect, the smart people in this room and the people like Steve and Travis and all the, like, the mockers. I also think it's also about individuals understanding the economic consequences of realigning that investment.
We do have the same challenge and have met it in terms of military bases closing, which represents the same source of employment for many people.
Yeah, but Steve, yes and no, because the federal government has much more flexibility, and then, so say for example, it has, when Fort Dix closes, that may impact the local resident community, but you can turn it into a housing complex and yada. But prisons are a relatively discrete and self-contained economic stimulus. It's a great question. Too bad if I didn't have an answer.
Hi there, I'm Levi from Seattle.
Seattle?
Yeah, it's a beautiful city. You can't see New Jersey from it, though.
But you can see Canada.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah, sometimes. You spoke to the idea that the opioid crisis prompted a larger reconsideration of drug policy. How do we jumpstart that kind of conversation when it comes to violent crime or sexual crime?
All right, so could you say a little bit more? I think I know where you're going. But.
So what I'm wondering is, how do we not wait until somehow the
next crisis?
Yeah.
That we not wait till whatever is going to precipitate.
However we end up getting away from mandatory 5-year additions for gun possession if you're already serving time for a drug crime or a violent crime.
That's a great question. Two things. Let me do it in reverse order. So in New Jersey, and there's something called Megan's Law, and we all voted for it. And now what happens is people who commit, there's 3 tiers of classifications. People have lifetime supervision. And I would argue an unintended consequence is that New Jersey is 40% of we have a 40% max out rate, almost 40% max out rate. So that if we're spending more time with lifetime supervision on sex offenders, and you can make an argument that that's having, solely on a financial basis, a negative impact in terms of the percentage of persons that are on parole or supervision in terms of capacity for those services. We have to be mindful that this is a zero-sum game. So the first point is that we always have to be willing, particularly when it's in our interest, to make the financial argument. The violence argument is interesting because you look at the raft of literature that's coming from places like John Jay, and looking at violence, that there is movement, say, for example, in New Jersey, and to the governor's credit, he had the former Supreme Court Chief Justice, Deborah Porwitz, look at the idea of rehabilitative parole for life sentences. So I think looking at the court and looking at legislative policy is a way to do that. So I think that's happening. The problem is the legislature isn't going to necessarily do that on their own without somebody providing the sanction in the imprimatur that this is the right thing to do. So always kick it to the court. Sure. Anybody else?
Yes.
Oh.
Hi, my name is Bethany Freudenthal, and I'm a reporter with Las Cruces Sun News. I'm also a former therapeutic foster parent and residential treatment center worker and assisted living caregiver. And we focused mostly this weekend on adult prison reform, and I'm curious, in your opinion, how community-based corrections would look within the juvenile system.
Great. Well, in fact, we're in the midst of doing that right now. I mean, Jamesburg, the governor's closing, Governor Christie and Governor Murphy embraced that, closing Jamesburg juvenile detention system, and now that they're looking to opening or to providing for 3 community-based alternatives in North Jersey, Central Jersey, and South Jersey, so that people are going to have access to their families, people will have access to training. When I was a young prosecutor, Governor Kane, who in New Jersey is the closest thing to a founding father, had a program called Middlefields, where he took kids out of urban areas, young guys and gals out of urban areas, or largely then urban areas, and provided them with skill-based training. What the hope, I think, now is of the reforms in Jamesburg are to provide for a community-based alternative where people will have access to medical care, to technical training, to job training, but also provide for linkage in the community. So I think it's happening. In New Jersey, the Juvenile Justice Commission is not under the Department of Corrections. It's under the Attorney General's office, which provides for a significant enhanced measure of flexibility in the system. The other thing, while we're talking about juveniles, which drives me nuts, is is the challenge of juveniles that are waived up into adult court and get what constitute to be lifetime decisions. And that's another issue that we're dealing with in New Jersey by virtue of a New Jersey Supreme Court decision. And we're looking at now moving that process through the legislature for these individuals that came into the system as juveniles, when their cognitive thinking, when their behavior, when their adaptation was at a rudimentary level as young men or young women, and the impact. So that's a population, that's a specific cohort with which we also have to grapple with. But I think we're moving in the right direction in New Jersey as to juvenile justice per se. Thank you.
Hi, Governor. How are you?
It's good to see you.
Nice to see you also. So you mentioned in your bio, Steve highlighted it, that you were once a prosecutor. So one of the interesting things going on in the movement these days is people are getting elected, going through the political process that also gives us, in some cases, judges, but state legislators and governors on reform platforms. And there's this interesting question of, is that a test of a new public will? And how do they deliver on, if they're running on a platform to end mass incarceration? So how should journalists and others think about this movement? And there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of, including our Attorney General, and has taken off. Is that an indicator of political, popular desire to do things very differently? And related question, to what extent should we even count on prosecutors to do anything?
So that's a great question. So part of it is how you frame the issue. If at the end of the day you frame the issue to be a prosecutor is in terms of the number of prosecutions, the number of successful prosecutions, obviously your matrix is going to be how many people you put into prison. So I think what's so important is that we change the rhetorical construct. The question is, how safe is the community? And if how safe is the community, that means that you want your police, your state troopers, your prosecutors, your public defenders, your social service agencies, that you want to embrace a notion of restorative justice. That at the end of the day, that you want to bring, you want to make the community whole. So I believe as a nation, we are shifting gradually from this binary sense of, the public, by the way, I'll just, as an anecdote, I get in trouble all the time with the public defenders because they just care about letting the young person out. And I'm like, shit, they've got a needle in their arm. They need to go to addiction treatment. No, they're innocent. I'm like, no. So part of it, I think the great freedom that we have in terms of in this space is to actually advocate vociferously for the well-being, the health of the person with whom we're dealing. But we also do it in the context of the health of the person and the health of the greater community. So it depends on what's the measuring stick. And I think the measuring stick, people understand that if I just simply put people in prison for long periods of time, that at the end of the day, even if it's after the tenure of the prosecutor, they're going to come out and there are going to be negative consequences for that term of imprisonment. And so I think that that metrics by which we measure our success or failure is changing. And I will tell you that if I would have never said this 5 years ago, some prosecutors are actually bigger advocates for reentry because now they have a toolbox. You know, I would never agree to consider myself a toolbox of the prosecutor's office, but they have something. So say, for example, on bail reform. Bail reform was a great idea. My frustration with bail reform in the state of New Jersey, and I just listened to New York Public Radio, but I don't know anything about New York bail reform, so I'm not going to wade into it. But on New Jersey, when Governor Christie first enunciated the idea of bail reform, I mean, Chris was doing it in part based on his experience as a federal prosecutor. And obviously the federal system has a much smaller population, but there's a much more robust set of services. So at the end of the long day, what I care about are services for our clients, whether it's addiction treatment, whether it's housing, whether it's employment and training. So in that sense, you know, the prosecutors, when they have bail reform in the state of New Jersey and Jim McGreevey gets arrested and I put my hand on that plastic contraption and I'm I think the scale is 1 to 6, and I'm a 4 or 5, even if, you know, you look at the Supreme Court and you look at the Attorney General in New Jersey, where it's a fairly progressive state, but a prosecutor may be more amenable to releasing if I'm reporting to, even for pretrial, to a reentry center to make sure that I'm getting proper treatment, I'm looking at an employment training program, I'm in a healthy housing situation. So in that sense, prosecutors have become advocates in New Jersey, as you well know. They're appointed, not run, but it's an interesting change. I mean, obviously I'm closer on the legal issues, so much more closer to the public defender's office. But on a day-to-day basis, there's an opening there that I would have never anticipated, and it's been really valuable. It's been really valuable. And then all of a sudden to have prosecutors sit down with, like Reverend Al Sharpton is on a board, National Action Network, sitting down and engaging in these issues, because I think there is that slow, albeit incremental, shift from, you know, prosecutions counted to community safety. And I think there's an opening there that your question is a good one, I never would have anticipated it.
We have one question here and then another one over there.
Hi, I'm Joe Dominic from the Center of Media Crime and Justice.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks for all your work.
Thank you. You mentioned the Australian model. I wonder if you could just, which you admire, if you could go over some of the components of that model?
Sure. And the guy over here could probably do it a lot more eloquently than I could. So what the Australian model has, and I'll quote for it, but I'd also look at the National Institute of Justice for their comprehensive intervention model, evidence best practices. There's the story of Roca, and they also have another case study, Building Trust and Legitimacy Within Community Corrections. I would look at both of those examples. But what the Australian model does, it looks to have community-based provincial state models that provide for all of the services that reentry would have, but except on the outset or immediate subsequent to sentencing. And so I would just say, you know, our perspective is alternatives to incarceration. When we think of alternatives to incarceration, we think of drug courts, probation, halfway houses, home confinement. I think they understand it fundamentally differently as an effort from the outset for successful integration into the community. Does that, I was going to ask the Ganzemacher, does that make sense?
Hi, Governor. My name's Noelle Crombie, and I write for the Oregonian in Portland, although I was born in Newark. I'm curious.
Welcome home, almost.
I'm curious if you could talk, this isn't a policy question, but you really could have gone on to do any number of things with your career, and you chose to do what sounds like almost social work or frontline work with a population that most Americans are sort of out of sight, out of mind. I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit on why.
So I'll give you the unvarnished answer, which is disappointingly ego-driven. So when I was in seminary, you have to so you blow up your career, and then so I'm at seminary, General Theological Seminary in Chelsea, and so I'm trying to figure out what to do, and I had always had a passion for. I'd worked historically with. One of the things I did as a kid, I worked with people in challenging circumstances, underprivileged kids growing up. But I remember that the dean of the seminary said you should go up to transitional Exodus in Harlem. And I remember, so the circumstances, you're from Oregon, but the circumstances of my coming out it just wasn't pretty. So I figured to myself, well, hey, I'm going to be hanging out with guys that committed aggravated assault and whatever. I mean, they're not going to think too badly of me. I'm going to be with, and I think what happened to me was just something really basic and really simple. I was shoulder to shoulder with these guys every day and gals, and I realized we all want the same thing in life. But we all don't start the race of life from the same place. And I was blessed to have parents and a community and support and thinking that helped me navigate through my present state, and that I also had resources that they didn't have in terms of familial support. And so I just began to realize that, and I was always, I'd always been, even as a prosecutor, and I was the executive director of the state parole board for Governor Kane. I had always had a deep interest in criminal justice, but I bought into the paradigm. Bless you. But I think at some level I just knew that this was wrong. I just knew that this was wrong. I knew it wasn't working. I mean, this gentleman here is a prophet. I mean, sincerely, we all accepted it as de rigueur, tough on crime. Both parties. And so that's why and just to be really personal, when you go through shit, your heart opens. And my own personal circumstances caused me, to 1 week you're on top of the food chain, the next week you're not doing too well, and it really causes you to rethink where, in terms of what America should be about, what community should be about, what opportunity should be about. And and also I met some great people. So thank you for that question. And when I take a caseload, Steve, I take a caseload regularly, so I stay in close contact with our program participants, and it's the best part of what I do because it keeps it so real. I mean, I deal with people's, I get guys on Suboxone and then they're drinking vodka and doing coke, and I'm like, what are we doing here? And then I work with people that have challenges on employment, challenges on housing, challenges on the legal system. And the legal system in America is almost like sticky paper. Like once you get into this shit, you can't get out. It's like you're stuck. It just keeps coming back. It's like I want to perform an exorcism just to get out of it. So I just realized that, and that's what's the greatest blessing is to go back to that. So thank you.
I have one more question.
Sure.
I don't know if I even need the mic. So essentially,
You got a hell of a radio voice.
yeah.
I'm ready to buy. No.
So I know the system overall is unjust, and we all.
And what's your name?
Oh, sorry about that. My name is Kush. I'm from a community service society. I'm a campaign liaison for the Clean Slate New York initiative. So I know overall the system is unjust, and everybody's affected by it in different ways. But there are some who are able to ascend to a higher tier of the system. For example, elected officials, and especially people who head state governments. So they get to the point where they're able to influence others in which the ways your clients at Exodus aren't able to influence. So how can you, as someone who reached that top tier of the government, of the system, pass this word of this need for reform to others as well?
Kush, great. So I work, the program that I work for now is New Jersey Reentry, but I'm telling you, we're doing something with the Republican Governors Association. They're doing some work on criminal justice, and the young guy who worked for me, John Kufos, he was there when President Trump, I'm like, please don't send me those pictures. But anyway, but so you see with the RGA, the DGA, to go to somebody's point is, it's all on the local state level. So now all of a sudden, whether it's the Democratic Governors Association or the Republican Governors Association, the National Conference on State Legislatures, so people get this, but it goes to the heart of your question. I mean, 20 years ago, that wasn't the question. 20 years ago, the question wasn't, the question was who could be tougher on crime? I mean, when you look at that chart of the number of crimes that have been instituted during the history of our nation, and it increases exponentially, like off the charts. Now there's a new question. And the fact that the RGA and the DGA and the National Governors Association and the National Conference of State Legislatures are grappling with these questions, to me, says that elites, thought leaders, are beginning to understand, and they're typically behind the populace, but they're beginning to understand that there's a changing dynamic. And that's what's interesting.
Okay, so last year in this room, we had Attorney General from New Jersey, Gerbier Gruel.
Yes,
I
great
think
guy.
we're going to call this the New Jersey room from now on. But you were as compelling, if not more, so I want to thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you, Stephen. And if I could just ask you to go on our website, it's NJ Reentry, so NJREENTRY.org. And I should also introduce Leanne. Leanne, just wave. Leanne also works with the great Michael K. Williams. You guys are all too young, but for those of you who are Wire fans, somebody says, of course, thank you, but you're dating yourself. Michael is our standard bearer, and we works really closely. We do a lot of reentry programs here with Michael, and I want to just thank Leanne for also being here. Leanne, could you please wave?
And please join me in thanking the governor.
Thank you so much for listening.
So we're reconvening upstairs? No, downstairs. Upstairs. Where are we? Downstairs, sixth floor again.